slip the surly bonds of earth and dance the skies on laughter-silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds and done 100 things you have not dreamed of. Wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up the long, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the windswept heights with easy grace, where never lark or even eagle flew. And while with silent, lifting mind I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touch the face of God.
Hi, and welcome to the 10th installment of the Dad Project, the first of several I had planned about my dad's time in Vietnam. Glad to have you back, and tonight we will follow my dad as he makes his way to a Navy base that is now loaded with cultural significance. Miramar, Fightertown, USA, the original home of Top Gun and part of the movie Top Gun, just north of San Diego. Here my dad, Pete Purvis, would be attached to VF-121 to be introduced and familiarized with the F-4B Phantom before he was let loose over the skies of Vietnam. But first let's see how and why he and his fellow airmen found themselves thousands of miles away from home in one of the most heavily defended airspaces on Earth. As World War II was winding down, it was obvious that the political power structure that existed before the war was no longer viable. Great Britain was in effect destitute. It had spent its fortune and much of its youth to honorably stem Hitler's efforts to enslave as much of the world as possible. With it would be the slow but inevitable erosion of its vast pre-war empire and the political power that went with it. For all their efforts, the Germans and Japanese managed to decimate most of what they had hoped to dominate. If not for the largesse of programs like the Marshall Plan for Europe and the occupation and reconstruction of Japan, it's hard to say how either of those countries may have fared had those who preferred reparations like those following World War I had held sway. It would be the United States and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, that would rise as the dominant powers from the ashes of the conflagration that claimed the lives of 60 million people. The term superpower had been bandied about during the war, and in a volume written in 1944, William T.R. Fox would coin the term and identify the superpowers as the U.S., the USSR, and Great Britain. It wouldn't be until after the war, as Great Britain's political and military star began to wane, that the term would be reserved for the Soviet Union and the U.S. alone. Although Winston Churchill saw the British people through the war as their prime minister, he was voted out of office soon after VE Day on July 9th of 1945. Through several wartime conferences where he interacted personally with Stalin, he felt that they had a good rapport and that he could trust him. But as it became obvious that Stalin was working diligently to expand the Soviet sphere of influence following the war, he would deliver a speech at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri on March 5, 1946, where in his beautiful, sonorous, and dulcet tones he would use the term Iron Curtain that perfectly described the division between East and West. Stalin himself would bring home the dangers that existed on the heels of World War II and how the Soviets intended to proceed going forward when, on February 9, 1946, he delivered a speech at a meeting of voters in Moscow where he stated that World War II broke out as the inevitable result of the development of world economic and political forces on the basis of present-day monopolistic capitalism, and that the development of world capitalism in our times does not proceed smoothly and evenly, but through crises and catastrophic wars. And finally, as a result of this, the capitalistic world is split in two hostile camps and the war breaks out between them. The conclusion to be drawn from this, as Stalin continued to stress, was that war was inevitable as long as capitalism existed, and that the Soviet people must prepare for this eventuality by sacrifices over the next 3 or more 5-year plans. For many in the U.S. power structure, this speech was an ominous and veiled suggestion to the inevitability of World War III. Even Time magazine called it the most warlike pronouncement uttered by any top-ranked statesman since VJ Day. George Kennan, then the deputy head of the U.S. mission in Moscow, had been asked to respond to Stalin's speech. On February 22, 1946, Kennan responded with a lengthy 5,363-word telegram, better known as the Long Telegram, to then Secretary of State James Burns, where he famously outlined a new strategy for diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. As lengthy as the telegram was, it could have been summed up in one word: containment. It would be Kennan's telegram that solidified the Truman administration policy to contain Soviet expansionism in Europe, a policy better known as the Truman Doctrine. In his address to a joint session of Congress on March 12, 1947, Truman would ask for $400 million to bolster the governments of Turkey and Greece, and would introduce the idea of the domino theory to further his request for those funds. But it wouldn't be until April 7, 1954, at a news conference given by President Eisenhower, that the term would gain traction and define our statecraft in Indochina. He was asked by Robert Richards of Copley Press, "Mr. President, would you mind commenting on the strategic importance of Indochina to the free world? I think there has been across the country some lack of understanding on just what it means to us." Eisenhower answered, "First of all, you have the specific value of a locality and its production of materials that the world needs. Then you have the possibility that many human beings pass under a dictatorship that is inimical to the free world. Finally, you have broader considerations that might follow what you would call the falling domino principle. You have a row of dominoes set up, you knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is the certainty that it will go over very quickly. So you could have a beginning of a disintegration that would have the most profound influences. So, with our enemy, the Soviet Union, behind the Iron Curtain, devoting one 5-year plan after another in preparation for World War III, the West set about to contain any of those aspirations, and the Cold War began in earnest." In Eisenhower's farewell address as president on January 17, 1961, he famously warned about the rise to power of the military-industrial complex that had begun following World War II and through his presidency. However, a more thorough reading of that speech makes clear that what he also said was that the U.S. must indeed be wary of that outcome, but that a vital element in keeping the peace is our military establishment. Our arms must be mighty, ready for instant action, so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well, but now we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions, thus the warning. So, as we waited for the Soviet bear to strike en masse through the folded gap in West Germany, we set about defending a domino thousands of miles away and well outside the Iron Curtain in Indochina, in countries whose names would become synonymous with the futility of containment, and as Mark Twain quipped, God created war so that Americans would learn geography. Following the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, Vietnam would be partitioned into North and South. The North would quickly fall under Communist control and led by Ho Chi Minh. Eisenhower would send 700 military advisors to the South to help keep the North from reuniting the country under Communist rule. When John F. Kennedy came into office, he quickly sent another 500 advisors in early 1961, and by the end of 1962, there would be 11,000 advisors on the ground in Vietnam. Then, on November 1st, 1963, the puppet government of President Ngo Dinh Diem fell, and following his refusal to resign, he was assassinated. Kennedy had earlier been told by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Maxwell Taylor that the U.S. could begin to draw down the in-country advisors by the end of 1963. But Kennedy would be assassinated on November 23rd of that year. With Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson being sworn in as president on Air Force One as it returned to Washington, D.C. from Dallas, that drawdown would never happen. Anyone who has followed this project may wonder why the Navy needed my dad in Vietnam. After all, other than being trained as a test pilot, he was a well-seasoned ASW pilot, having spent a few thousand hours of flight time flying low and slow in search of Soviet submarines. But I've also mentioned the ominous and often unfair term, the needs of the Navy, and its ability to change the rules midstream. Operation Rolling Thunder had quickly become overwhelmed by attrition, both men and materiel. The Navy needed more men to carry out the bombing missions over North Vietnam, not more SW pilots. My dad's fate was sealed. Having only served a year and a half on his 3-year hitch as the assistant navigator and cod driver on the USS Randolph, he was given new orders to report to the F-121 at Miramar in July of 1966 for his introduction to the F-4 Phantom as a fleet replacement pilot. By the time my dad drove through the gates for the first time at Miramar, Operation Rolling Thunder had already been underway over the skies of Vietnam since March 2, 1965, 2 years or so. Operation Rolling Thunder was the most concentrated use of air power since the Allies' bombing campaign of Germany in World War II. It would last nearly 3 years with the hope that air power alone could dissuade the North Vietnamese from their continued support of the Viet Cong in the South. Operation Rolling Thunder was finally curtailed in November of 1968. In 1925, Colonel Billy Mitchell had written Wing Defense, The Development and Possibilities of Modern Air Power, Economic and Military. In it, he says, independent applied air power in the form of strategic bombers could paralyze an enemy's vital centers, thus obviating the need to confront enemy surface forces or even to advance through enemy territory on the ground. The influence of air power on the ability of one nation to impress its will on another in an armed conflict will be decisive. Despite being court-martialed and giving up his commission, Mitchell's influence on strategic bombing as a tool of war was significant, and that influence would be seen in the Allies' bombing campaign over Germany, Japan, and a few years later in Operation Rolling Thunder, and more recently in the 2003 invasion of Iraq with the TV-ready but ultimately hollow term shock and awe. It would be a combination of Mitchell's thoughts on air power and this misunderstood quote from Clausewitz's book On War, "War is the continuation of politics by other means," that would drive Operation Rolling Thunder. When Kennedy came to office, he made Robert McNamara, a former Ford executive, the Secretary of Defense, who then brought with him a group of experts from the RAND Corporation, the Whiz Kids, to reimagine the Department of Defense. This would include introducing economic analysis, operations research, game theory, computing, among other things, to implement modern management systems into what they considered an arcane and Byzantine military structure. McNamara and his Whiz Kids initially came aboard with the conceit that a war could be analyzed, massaged, and managed from their offices in D.C., thousands of miles away from the actual fight, and then the results used as a stick and/or carrot to dictate the politics with their adversary, North Vietnam. In the case of Operation Rolling Thunder, this would lead to often contradictory orders, rules of engagements, ROEs, that would hamstring the pilots and allow the North Vietnamese breathing room to assess U.S. tactics and to set up a very effective anti-aircraft systems while the bombing efforts ebbed and flowed at the whim of D.C. and the weather. This was helped in no small measure by the North Vietnamese playing the Chinese and Soviet regimes off one another, that resulted in North Vietnamese having near unlimited supplies of low and medium altitude anti-aircraft guns, surface-to-air missiles, SAMs, and aircraft that would wreak havoc with American air forces. No plan survives first contact with the enemy is an adage about war with uncertain origins that applies well to Operation Rolling Thunder. What was hoped to be a proverbial home-by-Christmas operation was dragged out for close to 3.5 years at huge expense of material, men, and morale. As mentioned earlier, Operation Rolling Thunder was well underway by the time my dad arrived at Miramar and reported to VF-121. VF-121 was a Fleet Replacement Squadron, FRS, responsible for taking pilots like my dad who were transitioning from one type of aircraft to another, a Category 2 student, in this case from the S-2 to the F-4B Phantom. Like every other aircraft my father had flown in the Navy, a bulky NATOPS flight manual for the Phantom would be dropped on his desk. He would then be put through a flight training regimen that began with 20 hours in the TF-9J, then into the Phantom F-4B cockpit, the first of 82 different F-4s he would fly, to master the flight characteristics of this hulking beast. And before he could fly on and off a boat, he made 97 field carrier landings, FCLs. Following those FCLs and 127 hours of flight time, he and his radar intercept officer, Rio, Lieutenant Cooper, flew to the USS Constellation, CVA-64, off the coast of California for carrier quals. As part of the Connie's workup cycle before it left on its next deployment to Vietnam in April of '67, my dad and his squadron mates in VF-121 flew to the Connie for their carrier quals and to put the Connie through its paces before the Connie's deployment to Vietnam. For my dad, that meant 2 initial touch and goes, and then 23 traps and 23 cat shots from February 19th through the 22nd of '66. And completing that, his logbook was stamped with a blocky and inky VF-121 pacemaker stamp, denoting his final flight with the squadron, the Navy's trust in his ability to handle the F-4B, and his orders to join his next squadron, VF-151, the Vigilantes, that would be attached to the USS Coral Sea, CVA-43, Carrier Wing 15. Finally, on July 26, 1967, the Coral Sea, with its complement of aircraft, officers, and enlisted men, would weigh anchor and sail beneath the Golden Gate Bridge on its way to Vietnam. On that journey, she would make ports of call at Pearl Harbor, Subic Bay, the Philippines, and Yokosuka, Japan, before arriving at Yankee Station to relieve the USS Bonhomme Richard, CVA-31, as a member of the Tonkin Gulf Yacht Club. From there, for the next 9 months of a 6-month cruise, more on this later, my father would fly over the beach 100 times on what he called his big adventure. So, until next time when we continue with my dad's big adventure and take a deeper dive into the F-4, thanks for joining me for the 10th installment of the Dad Project. I continue to tell the stories I had hoped my father would tell me, and I appreciate y'all being along for the journey. So please subscribe if you'd like to hear more. And until next time, thanks for watching and enjoy what life has given you. Ciao.